Hi, I'm Lutz Kaufmann. I'm here today with Moritz Schreiner and Felix Reimann, my co-authors, to speak about narratives in negotiations with suppliers. So, narratives or stories, they're with us since childhood as fairy tales. They're also omnipresent in business, be it in commercials or quite prominently in Shark Tank or Dragon's Den, when entrepreneurs pitch their business ideas to investors. Also, when in court, lawyers can't come with a list of bullet points or single influencing techniques. Just look at the series Suits. These guys are always using stories in front of the judge, be it Harvey Specter or Mike Ross or even Louis Litt. However, their effectiveness in negotiations with suppliers was surprisingly not investigated. So with our research, we wanted to answer two research questions. Number one, what are typical design elements of narratives that buyers use in the starting phase of buyer-supplier negotiations? And research question number two, how can these design elements be combined in a way to create narratives that work effectively in a buyer-supplier negotiation context? To answer number one, we had buyers compose narratives in workshops. And to answer number two, we had B2B sales managers, the targets of those stories, judge the effectiveness of the stories. Our theoretical contributions are twofold. First, we expand narrative transportation theory. We show that narratives consist of interlinked design elements and that narrative effectiveness is a causally complex phenomenon. Second, for the field of supply chain management, we develop theory by A, introducing narratives as an additional means of influence in buyer-supplier negotiations, and by B, examining the interplay between narrative design elements, structural power, and negotiation outcomes that are specific to the buyer-supplier relationship.
To tackle those two research questions that Lutz has just lined out, we engaged in a multi-method, multi-stage qualitative research approach. We started out by conducting expert interviews, for example with CPOs and procurement managers, to really understand how they used narratives in their negotiations with suppliers. We then took essentially everything that we learned within these interviews to craft scenario-based vignettes. These vignettes were used in the next stage of our approach in the writing workshops. Within the writing workshops, the buyers crafted their own narratives in preparation for a negotiation with a potential new supplier. In the next step, we analyzed those narratives to identify common themes and commonalities that were overarching across all of these narratives in order to answer our first research question. In the next step, we conducted another set of experiments where we shifted the focus to the targets of these influence tactics, that is, to the sales managers. We used the mirror image of the scenario-based vignettes that we created earlier for the narrative writing workshops, now for the sales managers. We presented them one of the narratives in order to observe their negotiation behavior, that is, we measured their level of trust into the buyer, and we measured their willingness to compromise financially over the course of the negotiation. Using these two outcomes, we were able to identify effective and ineffective narratives. We then took this assessment of effectiveness and the earlier derived codes of the narrative design elements as input for our later FSQCA to identify patterns or configurations of effective narrative design elements that lead consistently to high negotiation influence. With regard to our first research question, we found out that narratives are essentially composed of different interlinked elements, what we call design elements. And just like ingredients with your favorite recipes, they can be combined in a multitude of different ways. For buyer narratives, we found out that there are essentially three different overarching elements that combine to a narrative, that is the perspective used within the narrative, the rationale provided within the narrative, and the tone of the narrative that creates the atmosphere. Perspective can be a buyer perspective, supplier perspective, and sometimes also comes with a dyadic or interactional perspective. Typically, there were either a social or an economic rationale used, and a warm and friendly, or a rather firm and tough up to aggressive tone. And this also leads directly to our second finding, especially that there is no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to buyer narratives and their effectiveness. What we have seen is that these elements can be combined in a multitude of ways, and there is no one perfect magic combination of narrative that is effective across all situations or for every aim or every objective. Specifically, we found that a narrative that may be effective for high power buyers, that means relatively to the supplier, may be ineffective for relatively low power buyers. And the same applies to the objective, that is, a narrative that is effective to increase willingness to compromise, on the other hand, might be not effective to increase trust.
Across the two outcomes, we identified 7 effective configurations as well as 6 ineffective configurations. All of these are explained in our paper. Here in this video, we just want to focus on one example to give you a sense for how these configurations work and what kind of conclusions can be taken away from these. So let's take the following situation. We are in a balanced power position, and our objective in the negotiation is to achieve better economic outcomes. How would we structure our narrative? What perspective would we use? What rationale would we use? And in which tone would we explain our narrative? Well, the results might be surprising for some. We found that an effective configuration in this situation is to use the buyer perspective, our own perspective, and combine this with a clearly economic rationale as well as a tough and firm tone. On the other hand, we found that an ineffective configuration, a configuration you should not use in the situation, is the buyer situation with a social rationale and combined with a warm and friendly tone. So friendliness is not necessarily a good idea to achieve better economic outcomes in this setting. Why is that? There are different conceivable explanations. One explanation is that overly friendliness and an overly social rationale in the situation might be interpreted as being inauthentic. Therefore, we labeled this configuration the inauthentic buyer, whereas the effective configuration the self-confident buyer. We think that there are 2 main conclusions that can be drawn from our study for theory. First, we're adding to narrative transportation theory in that we show that narratives are complex phenomena whose elements interact in various ways to lead to narrative outcomes. Second, we're building new theory for the field of supply chain management in that we develop 7 propositions on the context-specific effectiveness of narratives in buyer-supplier negotiations.
Now, how can, in our view, a company benefit from what we have seen so far? Well, simply if you create a collective memory and analyze it smartly. Start somewhere. Buyers can use our findings, they can use their own ideas. Just get started using stories in negotiations with suppliers. We would then, stage 2, recommend that the experiences with stories get collected. Companies should quickly profile the situation, story, and outcome. That allows the company then, in stage 3, to create an asset in the form of a tool or an app that, for example, AI-based, provides recommendations for future use in supplier negotiations. We hope you enjoy reading our article and using narratives.